We have moved into the 20th century. Actually, that building dates back, as you can see, to 1798, but it wasn't actually finished until around 1820. Students used to camp out in there. It had no roof, but Old East had obviously gotten way overfilled with people because that was the whole campus, and so people hung out in here camping for quite a while. But I think about South Building mostly in the 20th century because it was a site of protest, and it may still become a site of protest. But students occupied the Chancellor's office on several occasions, particularly in 1985 for the divestment from South Africa. We had a shanty town out here, and we had a Berlin Wall right next to it. That was one of my favorite counter protests. We also had, in 1991, when Dr. Sonia Stone died, students occupied the Chancellor's office to get a freestanding Black cultural center. And there's a movie, which if you're interested in university history, there's a movie called Don't Believe the Hype, which was a master's thesis of a student in comm studies here who happened to be writing his master's thesis while the struggle for the Stone Center was occurring. So he has interviews with participants, he has interviews with Chancellor Hardin, he has footage of Spike Lee being in the Dean Dome. Spike Lee came here as part of our struggle. And there's footage of a group of students being arrested right here, and the people out here supporting them. So this is an interesting site of protest. But the reason I think this is such a fascinating area is this is the physical location of desegregation on this campus. This building in 1939 briefly housed the first unofficial Black student on campus. Starting in the 1930s, usually when we think of desegregation, we think of the 1950s, but in fact, even at the federal level, the 30s was the era when graduate education was being debated with the Gaines case. And a student at North Carolina College for Negroes, which was created to be the Black UNC, right? As a separate but equal institution, we had North Carolina A&T to be the Black NC State, and North Carolina College for Negroes, which is now Central, created to be the Black UNC. If we supplied a separate but equal institution, we wouldn't have to desegregate the white institutions. And so in 1930, North Carolina College for Negroes was created. A student who graduated from North Carolina College named Thomas Hocutt wanted to study pharmacy. And so he was going to come to UNC Chapel Hill. Well, he wanted to come to Chapel Hill because obviously you couldn't just set up a pharmacy school for one person. Well, it's not really that obvious. The law school at Central, to keep UNC's law school from being desegregated, consisted of 2 UNC law professors who went to Durham one day, twice a month. Every other Friday, 2 UNC law professors went to Durham, and the law librarian went. That was the law school. You couldn't do that with the pharmacy school. So Mr. Hocutt applied, but the president of Central, James Shepard, refused to help him. Shepard wanted strong Black institutions being funded by the state, so he wouldn't release his transcript. So Mr. Hocutt was not admitted, and it never really went anywhere because there was no transcript to worry about. Pauli Murray, as I told you, applied not long after that and also didn't get a lot of support. That was in 1938. In 1939, Central was given money to improve its English department, right, to prevent Black students from coming to Chapel Hill. James Shepard used that money to hire a new professor. The professor he hired was Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston's history with North Carolina is not as well known as it should be, particularly the fact that after she was hired, she came to UNC Chapel Hill to study playwriting with Paul Green. Paul Green is going to be the subject of the tour in a month. So see how it all comes together. And we have a few letters of Zora Neale Hurston's here, but very few. But anyhow, she came to take classes on campus in 1939, but was not greeted with open arms by the students. Particularly the freshmen did not treat her very nicely. And Zora Neale Hurston was not the kind of person to keep her mouth shut, if you've read about her. And so people would sass her, she would sass them back, and that was not a safe thing to do. So Paul Green moved the classes to his house. She was fired in 1940, and so that's the end of Zora Neale Hurston in this area. But so there was this history in the 30s of black people applying to the graduate schools, a black person taking classes. But interestingly, it is right here where the desegregation of the campus actually happened. If you're an undergrad here, you're familiar with Steele Building, right? Because it's where your advisor is. But before it was advising, like many of the buildings, like my office building, Battle Hall, it was a dormitory. Now, my building is interesting because I used to have an office at the bottom corner on the first floor, and people around campus and in the broader community they found out that my office used to be Andy Griffith's dorm room. And people would come by, it's just a faculty office, but people would come by and, oh, look, it's Andy Griffith's dorm room. And that seemed to be fairly well known. The third floor on the north side was the segregated dormitory at UNC Chapel Hill. That was where the first black graduate students and later the first black undergraduates were required to live. So I like to point out we were desegregated, but we did not integrate. And other universities watched what we did in order to have the process go a little bit better. But the very first students lived up there, and I've had over the years I've been here lots of friends who worked in advising. It is not common knowledge in the advising building that that was the segregated dorm, and I think that's more important than where Andy Griffith lived, personally. One of the people who lived here was the first black person to graduate from UNC. He came to UNC in 1951 and he graduated from UNC in 1951 because he had already completed the coursework at the law school at North Carolina College. And his name is Floyd McKissick. Floyd McKissick should be famous to you, or should be known to you. I mean, he should be as famous as Zora Neale Hurston. He was the leader of CORE for a while. He was the founder of Soul City in central northern North Carolina. He was a civil rights lawyer and activist, and if you drive around Durham, you'll still see his name at election time because his grandson is a politician. Ralph and Leroy Frazier and John Brandon were the first three black undergraduates. They did not live here in 1955. They all came from Hillside High School in Durham, and they all stayed in Durham for the first year. In 1956, however, they did come to Chapel Hill. As you saw in the visitor center, that picture of them standing in front of the South Building is a very famous picture. What's not so famous and what we don't talk about so much is that none of them graduated from the University of North Carolina. As you can imagine, being segregated on a desegregated campus, getting an athletic pass stamped with the word colored. There were 3 black undergraduates on campus. Do you think you actually needed to stamp the word colored on so that people would know which ones they were? It was, of course, to remind them that they were the black people on campus. When they were allowed to go to football games, they had to sit where the black staff was able to do it. Just like when women started going into medicine in large numbers, at first they were required to do their changing with the nurses because they had female and male areas, not doctor and nurse. But I think that's a really important part of the story we don't tell, is that, we seem, yay, we desegregated and that was it. Well, think about the cafeteria worker strike I was telling you about. The black student movement saw the treatment of black people on this campus as a real problem, almost 20 years after the first black students came here. And that continuing struggle, I think, is a very important issue to discuss. As was pointed out by the Daily Tar Heel in fairly strong terms last year, we admitted 98 black freshmen men, right, out of 4,000 students. That's kind of scary to think about 50-some years after the first 3 black men came here. What's going on? That's an issue that we're discussing. It's being discussed in South Building quite a bit right now. But the things that this tour is about are not things where the story has ended. But to that end, if you've got the time, I know we've basically run out of time, but anybody who wants to see the graveyard, come with me. What other place would you end the story?